Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmidt, and today we're in part 6 of an epic series covering common mistakes about philosophy and religion that people often, or at least sometimes, make on the internet sphere. Definitely check out the playlist, which will eventually house the full 7-part series of videos that should be popping up in the corner. I already covered some important preliminary points in part 1 of the series, so let's just jump right into the mistakes. And of course, be sure to check out the resource document linked in the description. So, today, the mistakes all concern models of God. So, basically, just mistakes about things like divine properties, ways of viewing God and God's relationship to the world, things like divine simplicity, classical theism, non-classical theism, Thomism, etc. These sorts of topics are particularly prone to confusion and mistakes, so I actually had to leave many mistakes out in order to keep both this video and the series at large to a relatively manageable length. Still, though, I think there will be lots of things that will hopefully be helpful today, and that will also hopefully raise the level of discourse surrounding these topics. So with that out of the way, let's get into mistake number 142, and this is, of course, continuing on from part 5, which you should immediately watch if you haven't seen it. So this mistake is defining omnipotence in terms of mere logical possibility. So oftentimes I've seen people define omnipotence in the following terms, saying X is omnipotent. What that means is that X is able to cause any event that it's logically possible that X could cause. But this is a deeply implausible account of omnipotence. The account shouldn't be written in terms of logical possibility, that is, mere formal consistency or absence of formal contradiction. After all, there's nothing logically impossible or formally strictly inconsistent about a being creating water that's H3O instead of H2O, but plausibly that's not metaphysically possible, as water is essentially H2O, and hence nothing is able to cause that to be the case. Examples like this can be multiplied ad nauseum, and in fact, we saw in an earlier part of this series, namely the part which covered the ontological argument, and in particular the modal ontological argument, that lots of things are going to be logically possible that nevertheless couldn't obtain in reality. They're not actually metaphysically possible. There's no way that reality could be such that the thing obtains, or that the thing is true. And in that case, omnipotence should not be defined in terms of logical possibility, in terms of God being able to do or create anything that's logically possible. That's just not how it should be defined. At the bare minimum, we should be casting this in terms of metaphysical possibility. So yes, that's mistake number 142. Do not define omnipotence in terms of mere logical possibility. Okay, mistake number 143. Claiming that God's omniscience and his freedom strictly entail that he must be perfectly good. I've seen people argue like this all the time. I think they're following in Swinburne's footsteps. They basically say, hey, like being omniscient and perfectly free, God has to be perfectly good. He'll always perform the best action, if there is one, and many good actions and no bad actions. Given God's omniscience, he would know the nature of each available action that he can choose from, and thus would possess knowledge of whether each action is good or bad, or is better than some incompatible action. Moreover, in recognizing an action as good, God would have some motivation to perform that action, and in recognizing an action as being better than another action, God would have an even greater motivation to perform it. Importantly, though, even if a being knows which action is good, or axiologically best, that is, which has the greatest value, it doesn't follow that the being is thereby motivated to act that way, right? The being may simply have a preference structure which leads it to prefer bad actions, or the worst action. To get around this, one would have to add claims about the being's motivations. But then it's no longer true that omnipotence and omniscience themselves imply perfect goodness. You have to add in further controversial postulates about motivation to deliver that result. Anyway, this one isn't so common on the internet sphere, but at least among certain groups, which are relatively small, it is pretty common. And I just wanted to address it because I think it's mistaken, and I think we can all learn from addressing these sorts of things. All right, mistake number 144. If the doctrine of divine simplicity, that's DDS, divine simplicity, basically, for those of you who don't know, the doctrine of divine simplicity, at least in its traditional manifestation, says that God is altogether simple. He lacks parts. That includes physical parts, but it also includes metaphysical parts, which proponents of this traditional version of the divine simplicity think are basically any positive reality which is intrinsic to something, but which is distinct from that thing. A feature is intrinsic to something when it characterizes that thing in virtue of the way it is in itself, as opposed to how it kind of relates to or connects to things ad extra or outside of it. So proponents of this view are going to say that any of God's intrinsic properties are actually going to have to be numerically identical to God, so God's going to have to be numerically identical to his omnipotence, his omniscience. That's at least the version of divine simplicity that we're talking about here. So mistake number 144 says that if that doctrine of divine simplicity is false, well then God or God's character depends on God's properties. But of course, God can't be a dependent being, and so divine simplicity is true. This is one of the most popular arguments for divine simplicity. I think it's a mistake. That's why I'm including it on here. Oh, and by the way, when we say God's character, we're not talking about his personality, okay? We're talking about like the way that God is. So like when we're talking about the intrinsic character of something, we're talking about the way that that is intrinsically. So when we're talking about my intrinsic character, you could talk about my mass, you could talk about my property of being human. All these sorts of things are ways that I am intrinsically. So that's like my intrinsic character. So the mistake here is claiming that if divine simplicity is false, well then God, or how God is intrinsically, is going to have to depend on God's properties. But of course, God, and also the way that God is intrinsically, that can't depend on something distinct from God. Otherwise, God would seem to be a dependent being, and God isn't a dependent being. So divine simplicity must be true. Okay, that's the basic argument here. So yes, here's in blue, I'm just giving a rendition of one case where I saw this. So it says, God does not exemplify any numerically distinct properties, that is, proper metaphysical parts. Since if God were to exemplify these properties, he would be dependent on them in order to be what he is. Yet, as God cannot be dependent in this specific way, he must not be the bearer of any properties. Now, there are at least three huge problems with this sort of reasoning and this mistake more generally. First, numerically distinct properties need not be like metaphysical parts of God, right? That's only the case under a constituent ontology. Under constituent ontology, roughly speaking, I mean, it's basically just saying that, yeah, it's conceiving of distinct properties or distinct features as metaphysical parts of things, at least intrinsic features of properties. But opponents of divine simplicity need not grant a constituent ontology. They might be relational ontologists, which reject that properties are actual parts of objects. Or they may simply be nominalists who reject the existence of properties altogether. Second, it's simply false that if God were to exemplify numerically distinct properties, then God would be dependent upon them for his character, or the way that he is. This assumes a character-grounding view of properties, that is, a view according to which properties ground character. So in other words, this assumes that whenever something instantiates a property, like the property of redness, it's because the thing instantiates the property of redness that the thing is red. So its character, its being red, is explained by its having the relevant property, the property of redness. That's called a character-grounding view of properties. Having a relevant property grounds the character associated with it, grounds or explains the character associated with it. It's like having the property of blueness or having the property of triangularity under this sort of view is what grounds or explains or accounts for something's actually being triangular. It's actually having that character. But this is a deeply controversial view of properties, and the opponent of divine simplicity need not grant it. The opponent can hold instead that it's the character which grounds the possession of properties, not vice versa. It's precisely because, so these people might say, it's precisely because a dog is brown that it has the property of brownness. Peter van Inwagen, for instance, holds an anti-character grounding view of properties, like the one that I just mentioned, as do many others. In that case, God's character, the way that God is, need not be grounded in anything numerically distinct from God. Third, even if nominalism is false, at least of God, so that God does indeed have properties, and even if a relational ontology is false, or a constituent ontology is true, so that God's properties are indeed constituent parts of him, it does, and again, those claims are not required by denying divine simplicity. Even if we grant those, it still doesn't follow that God would depend for his existence on his parts. For God as a whole substance could ground his parts, and hence it's God's parts that depend on God. Since dependence is asymmetric, right? If x depends on y, well then y doesn't depend on x. It follows that God does not depend in turn on God's parts, right? They depend on him. He does not depend on them. Philosopher Gregory Fowler develops this view quite nicely in his paper Simplicity or Priority, and whole-to-part grounding of this sort is an entirely respectable notion in metaphysics. It's employed a ton by Aristotelians, and also philosophers like Jonathan Schaffer and many others in their priority monist views. So I so often see people reiterate this very common motivation for divine simplicity, and in my view, I don't think it works, and I think they should move on to better arguments. All right, mistake number 145. We're really at the bottom of the barrel here, aren't we? If God can change, well, then God can stop loving us. I literally heard a professional philosopher say something like this. I think this is a quote that I heard this professional philosopher say. If God can change in relation to creatures, then we have to countenance the possibility that God could change his mind and stop loving us because of a sin we commit, say. This is so wrong, and it's clearly a non sequitur. Merely from the fact that God can change in certain ways, say, come to know that a video is publicized and thereby change in knowledge, it doesn't follow in the slightest that God could change in any way whatsoever, such as stopping loving creatures. That would only be possible if that were consistent with God's nature, but it's not, right? Under non-classical theism, God is essentially loving and essentially merciful, and as such, he simply couldn't stop loving creatures, even though he could change in other respects, like change in his knowledge of what time it is, say. We're not going to dwell on that mistake because it's just so painfully wrong. But it's like, these are the sorts of sentiments that you find so much on, like, oh, that pathetic platform called Twitter or X. Okay, mistake number 146. A necessary being must be purely actual. Okay, so purely actual, they're basically just saying it has no potentials for change. So this mistake here is saying that a necessary being must be unchangeable. Like, it can't change in any respect whatsoever. It's just so wrong. Just because something necessarily exists, that's what we're talking about here when we talk about a necessary being, right? Something that necessarily exists. It's such that it cannot fail to exist. That's all that we're talking about when we're talking about a necessary being in this context. Just because something necessarily exists and so cannot fail to exist, or if we must speak this way, just because it has no potential for non-existence, it doesn't follow that it doesn't have any potentials whatsoever. In other words, just because it necessarily exists, it doesn't follow that it's necessarily the way it is in all respects whatsoever. It could necessarily exist and yet have potentials to change in its non-essential properties. I can still exist throughout various non-essential changes. Like, I got a haircut a few weeks ago. I didn't, like, get killed as a result of that. I mean, the people who cut people's hair, sometimes they may be particularly violent, and that may be the result, but it's certainly not always the result. So things can change or be different across worlds and nevertheless be the same thing throughout that change or throughout that variance across worlds. And that's because the relevant properties that they gained or lost, or the relevant properties that they have in one world and they don't have in another world, it's because those are non-essential properties. In other words, the thing can exist without having the relevant properties. Again, all that follows from necessary existence is that the object itself cannot fail to exist. It's an entirely separate question whether it could be different in other respects, such as its actions or its beliefs or other non-essential properties. Or like theists typically think that God is a necessary being, but God plausibly could be different in various ways. God believes that humans exist, but it could have been the case that he does not believe that humans exist, because he could have refrained from creating us. and in that world in which he refrains from creating us, clearly he doesn't believe in that world that we exist in that world, right? So God could at least vary or be different in respect of his beliefs, but that doesn't mean God isn't a necessary being. God could still exist in all worlds, despite having different beliefs in different worlds. Okay, mistake number 147, simply asserting that change is the actualization of potential, as if this were innocuous and uncontroversial. Again, I'm not saying it is a mistake to assert that change is the actualization of potential. I'm not saying that is the mistake here. I mean, I do think that's a mistake, but that's not the mistake that I'm talking about here. The mistake that I'm talking about here is that oftentimes when people are talking about, like, Aquinas' first way or arguments like that, they will often put so much attention on establishing, the claim that any actualization of potential requires some cause which does the actualizing, like any change requires a changer. They'll put so much effort into that, and they'll put so much effort into trying to rule out infinitely descending chains of hierarchical causation or parasaic causation. They'll try to rule these sorts of things out. But so often they'll just, like, at the very outset, they'll just assert that this is what change is. Change just is the actualization of potential. And you can't just assert that as if it were some innocuous and uncontroversial account of change. There are lots of difficulties with this sort of account of change. It's been challenged a ton in the philosophical literature. For starters, there aren't many good arguments for it. You can check out this little post here where I examine one of the most prominent arguments given on behalf of it, and it's not a good argument. At least in my view, it's implausible on its face. Like, at least as many defenders of this account of change articulate it, potency is like a way or kind of being. It's like a mode of existence, and it's somehow like in between sheer nothingness on the one hand and like full-blown actuality on the other. I mean, I kind of struggle to understand what that would be, but to the extent that I understand it, it just strikes me as incredibly implausible. Something either actually exists or doesn't exist at all. Like that, it just seems intuitively plausible to me. I'm not saying other people have to share this intuition, but again, I'm just saying that there are some difficulties with this account. And at least a number of people do indeed share this intuition that, well, something either just actually exists or doesn't exist impliciter. That's the end of the story. There's no like some ghostly, ethereal, in-between state of being between those. And the account of change assumes the incredibly unpopular view of ontological pluralism, according to which there are multiple ways or kinds or modes or types of existence or being. And there are lots of difficulties with that. There's actually a huge literature on ontological pluralism versus ontological monism, and the vast majority of contemporary metaphysicians are ontological monists. They think this ontological pluralism is either false or unintelligible. Don't get me wrong, there are, of course, contemporary defenders of ontological pluralism like Jason Turner and Chris McDaniel and some Aristotelians and Thomists and so on. But by far the dominant view, and this is recognized by ontological pluralists themselves in contemporary philosophy and contemporary metaphysics in particular, is ontological monism. And there are lots of reasons for that. And in fact, I had a video here with philosopher Trenton Merricks, who published an excellent paper criticizing ontological pluralism. We just went through that paper and talked about some other aspects of the debate here. So just check that out if you're interested. I'm not really trying to dwell on all these points here. I'm simply just trying to highlight that this account of of change cannot be simply asserted as if it's innocuous and uncontroversial, because there are at least a number of difficulties with it. And in addition to direct difficulties with the account, there are also alternative accounts of what change is. You can simply understand change in terms of the gain or loss of properties, or in terms of variance along the temporal dimension, like B-theoretic eternalists would kind of want to go down that route. But anyway, we're not going to get into like what that is. My point is just that there are lots of other accounts of change on offer, so one cannot simply assert that this is the correct account of change. And yet, at least in the popular sphere, so often people will indeed just simply assert it when they're going about articulating their model of God, or when they're going about arguing for their particular model of God. So that's why it fits into this kind of models of God portion. All right, mistake number 148. Divine simplicity is the simplest possible view. Okay, yes, tell me you don't understand theoretical simplicity without telling me you don't understand theoretical simplicity. Okay, so this is confusing. This is obviously confusing the simplicity of a being with the simplicity of a hypothesis, right? When we compare the theories, right? When we compare hypotheses, we're looking at the simplicity of the relevant hypotheses, not the simplicity of like a being, like in terms of whether or not it like metaphysically lacks parts. No, instead what matters is the theoretical characterizations and postulations one has to make in order to characterize the simple God. And those are many and varied, as I point out here. And so such a view still suffers from quite a great deal of theoretical complexity. It's quite an immodest view because it demands so much about ultimate reality and about God. And moreover, divine simplicity also doesn't allow us to condense our array of primitive or basic or undefined terms that we use within our theory. In fact, as Oppie argues quite convincingly in his debate book with Kenny Pierce, the analogical language that divine simplicity arguably requires in order to characterize God introduces whole swaths of new ideological complexity into one's theory, which is a serious and often underappreciated cost of divine simplicity. I highly recommend checking out their Rutledge book, Is There a God? A Debate. Also, I've heard many professional philosophers pronounce this as Rutledge, many pronounce it as Routledge. I've heard both of them among equally well-positioned and competent philosophers who have even published with them. So, like, if any of you know what the kind of quote-unquote official pronunciation there is, you know, I would greatly appreciate that. Also, if you enjoy this video and you enjoy my content more generally, smash that like button and consider supporting me on Patreon. Any amount helps. Thank you so much. Okay, moving on to mistake number 149, uncritical acceptance and deployment of Molinism without sufficient appreciation for its difficulties. Okay, so again, the mistake here is not being a Molinist or claiming that Molinism is true. Okay, that's not the mistake that I'm talking about here. That may very well be a mistake, but that's not the mistake that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about like just this kind of uncritical acceptance and deployment of Molinism with just while being totally oblivious to the various challenges that philosophers have raised to it. I've noticed this so much in kind of popular apologetics, where people, when they're responding to the problem of evil, or they're like responding to the problem of the unevangelized, or the theist or Christian is responding to whatever sort of problem, and they'll just completely assume Molinism, seemingly without even recognizing, firstly, that they're assuming it, but also, secondly, without any appreciation whatsoever, that it's a highly contested view with lots of, at least potentially serious objections to it. So I at least want people to be aware that Molinism does indeed have some, at least prima facie, difficulties, and it's important to be aware of that so that one is appropriately cautious when one is drawing on Molinism in order to solve certain theological problems or answer certain atheistic arguments. Yeah, as I say here, I'm not saying here that Molinism is false, that it's a mistake. I'm just saying that I've seen many theists wield it as a solution or an element of a solution to lots of different philosophical and theological problems while being totally oblivious to the serious challenges that Molinism faces, and while just uncritically accepting the view despite such challenges, and despite being unaware of them. This doesn't apply, of course, to every theist or even every theist on the internet, but it does apply to some, and I just want people to at least be more aware of these challenges. Okay. Of course, there's the very popular grounding objection and objections that Molinism problematically diminishes God's providence, or maybe it subjects God to a kind of perfection diminishing kind of luck, since it implies a huge class of contingent truths over which God has no control, namely the CCFs or counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, and there are many more standard objections besides. But right now I want to put a different and perhaps underappreciated objection on your radar. Again, I'm not here claiming that this objection succeeds. Rather, I'm simply trying to help ameliorate the fact that some people uncritically accept Molinism without being aware of or adequately appreciating some of its attendant difficulties, or at least attendant potential difficulties. So, lots of theists really like libertarian free will. And in particular, Molinists specifically like libertarian free will, specifically a kind of free will which requires leeway among alternative courses of action in order to be free and morally responsible. And in particular, almost all Molinists, if not all Molinists, do indeed like libertarian free will. But philosophers Nevin Klimenhaga and Daniel Rubio, in their 2022 Mind article, Molinism Explaining Our Freedom Away, as well as a number of other authors, such as philosopher Philip Swenson, have argued that Molinism implies that we do not have this kind of free will. So this is a pretty big problem for Molinists, especially if almost all of them, if not all of them, do indeed accept libertarian free will. So anyway, to explain this interesting and potentially serious problem, I'm going to kick it over to timestamp 11 hours, 17 minutes, and 8 seconds of my video here. So let's get into that. And even if you want to try to appeal to Molinism to try to get around this, there is a recent article by two really smart theists, Nevin Klimenhaga and Daniel Rubio, called Molinism Explaining Our Freedom Away. Daniel Rubio has been on the channel The Analytic Christian. Nevin Klimenhaga has been on Capturing Christianity. I really should be getting them on my channel to talk about this article because it's so good. It's actually forthcoming, so this is like hot off the press, by the way. So definitely check this out. You can find it on Phil Papers, by the way. It's freely available. You can read it. It's a very good article. They argue that Molinism is false, and their argument is quite powerful, at least by my lights. The basic idea is that if Molinism is true, well, then there are factors that are both, firstly, fully explanatorily prior to our decisions, and secondly, that strictly entail the decisions and actions that we do. And in that case, you're not going to be able to have libertarian freedom there because there are factors that are both explanatorily prior and sufficient for you choosing exactly how you choose. What are those factors? Well, it's going to be God's decision to place you in the relevant circumstances, together with the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which are not under your control or anything like that. Those are explanatorily prior to you deciding as you do, as is God's placing you in the relevant circumstances. And of course, those together are going to strictly entail what you do. So we have factors that are explanatorily prior to what you do, and they strictly entail what you do. They are sufficient for what you do. Dr. Philip Swenson has also done some really good work arguing against Molinism. The Analytic Christian has actually made a video with him on some of the published work that he's done with respect to criticizing Molinism, and his arguments are definitely a force to be contended with. So to get around the problem that I've said earlier, you might try to say that, oh no, the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are not themselves explanatorily prior to your choices in the circumstances. Rather, your choices in those circumstances explains why the relevant counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are true. But that it leads us into a vicious explanatory circle. Consider some counterfactual of creaturely freedom L. Philip would freely lie in circumstances C. Well, the fact that L is true explains why God knows that L, right? That someone knows that P, partly because P is true. Moreover, the fact that God knows that L partly explains why God puts Philip in circumstances C. This is how, under Molinism, God is providentially arranging history. He puts people in various circumstances, partly because he knows certain counterfactuals of creaturely freedom concerning what they would do in those circumstances. So we have an explanatory link from here to here. Moreover, the fact that God puts you in circumstances C partly explains why you choose to lie in C, right? It's partly because you're in the circumstances that you are, you're faced with this decision to lie, you're faced with the various pros and cons of lying and so on. It's partly because God put you in conditions C, then, that explains what you chose to lie in circumstances C. And then, of course, the hypothesis that we are assuming for reductio is precisely that your choosing to lie in C is itself what explains the truth of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom. So this is a vicious explanatory loop. We started with L, and then we have a chain of explanation that eventually terminates back in L. So we just have a vicious explanatory circle. Again, I'm just pointing out how someone might try to get around that Klimenhaga and Rubio argument by saying, oh, well, the fact that you freely choose as you do in the relevant circumstances, that is actually explanatorily prior to the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom concerning what you would do in those circumstances, rather than the other way around. But that's actually just going to land you in an explanatory vicious circle, so that's not going to be an option to get around it. And in that case, the counterfactual of creaturely freedom is going to be explanatorily prior to your choosing to do what you do in the relevant circumstances, and that, together with God's putting you in those circumstances, are going to be things that are both explanatorily prior to what you do and that are sufficient for what you do. That is, they guarantee that you do precisely what you are going to do. And in that case, libertarianism is false. And of course, at the end there, we are relying on a principle that if there are factors that are beyond your control, that are not explained by what you do, and that nevertheless inevitably lead to what you do and explain what you do, then you could not have done otherwise on that particular occasion. This is a principle that libertarians themselves very, very often use when they're trying to motivate libertarianism. They very often appeal to what's called the consequence argument in order to motivate the incompatibilist portion of their libertarianism. And in particular, they try to argue that, well, hey, if determinism is true, well then, our actions are the inevitable consequences of prior conditions over which we have no control. There's nothing we can do such that were we to do it, those facts about the past or the laws of nature would be different, and those facts about the past and the laws of nature strictly entail exactly what we're going to do. And so since we have no leeway with respect to the former, we don't have any leeway with respect to the latter. It's roughly the same kind of principle that's being appealed to in the sort of argument against Molinism that I was just adumbrating. But anyway, see the video that I just mentioned from Philip Swenson and the paper that I just mentioned for a much more formal and rigorous defense of the various steps that you need in this kind of argument that challenges Molinism. So, yeah. Now, again, you might just think like, okay, fine, the Molinist has to give up a kind of libertarian freedom on which we have leeway among alternative courses of action. So what? One potential difficulty for that is, just motivations for thinking that leeway among alternative possible courses of action is necessary for our acting freely or our being morally responsible. There are lots of different motivations for that kind of principle of alternative possibilities, or PAP. Of course, you can see my discussion with Taylor Sear for some challenges to that. But anyway, any challenge to that is thereby going to be a challenge to Molinism. But again, there's also the fact that almost all Molinists accept this kind of libertarian freedom. All right, mistake number 150, composition entails contingency. So, we actually already covered this mistake in the Kalam and contingency argument episode in this series. Yes, it's a duplicate mistake. So why not remove it, you ask? Well, because I would have to fix all the numbering throughout the rest of this script and the next script, and ain't nobody got time for that. Okay, mistake number 151, thinking that non-classical theistic views of God basically make God like Zeus, or that they anthropomorphize God. So, little anecdote. I once heard a philosopher say, I can't get myself to believe in a God who's an old bearded guy in the sky. That would just be a fairy tale. And I say, of course, that seems pretty reasonable. But the philosopher then went on to ask, what's wrong with such a concept of God? The problem is that a guy who has a beard has parts and changes. Whether the parts are material or immaterial doesn't seem of deep metaphysical significance, according to this person. But having parts or changing, either one of these is an absurd anthropomorphism, according to this philosopher. And so, according to them, they can't get themselves to believe in a God who changes or has parts. And as I say here, this surely takes the cake for the worst argument for classical theism that since I wrote this, I've been on Twitter a little, and I've seen worse arguments on Twitter. So this takes the cake as one of the worst arguments for classical theism that I've come across. Okay, listen, there are lots of relevant dissimilarities between the bearded sky man and a non-classical theistic God. For sake of simplicity, let's suppose that our non-classical theistic model affirms divine timelessness, but says that God's omnipotence, moral goodness, timelessness, necessity, and so on are numerically distinct properties of God, which to me seems really, really, really plausible, but perhaps my sense of obviousness isn't shared by everyone, so I'm not going to rest content there. So again, my basic response to this, and why it's a mistake, is that there are lots of relevant dissimilarities between the bearded sky man and this non-classical theistic God, which render the former, an absurd fairy tale, but the latter, no, doesn't inherit that sense of absurd fairy tale-ness. I mean, unless you're like, one of those new atheists who always comment like, Sky Daddy, Sky Daddy. But, we're at the grown-ups table here. So anyway, what are some of these relevant dissimilarities that undermine this philosopher's argument? Well, first, there's a kind of essential, metaphysically necessary, and intelligible unity to God's parts that is absent from the bearded sky man. It's no coincidence, for instance, that omniscience, omnipotence, and so on are co-instantiated in God. Right? They all flow from some more fundamental aspect of God, namely God's pure perfection. These attributes are all unified by them being great-making properties, or perfections. And so they all flow from, and are explained by, and are entailed by, a more fundamental aspect of God, namely God's pure perfection. And so it's no coincidence that these properties are co-instantiated in God. But by contrast, a bearded sky man involves a whole host of seemingly arbitrary limitations and coincidences. Why is the beard 7.8 inches long instead of 7.81 or 7.89? Why isn't he cleanly shaven? And so on. I mean, in the case of God, right? In the case of the non-classical theistic God, God's unlimited perfection can provide the resources for seeing why each of God's numerically distinct attributes are all compresent with one another, without any arbitrariness or possibility of being separated from one another, and without any, limitations. By contrast, the bearded sky man is limited. He has lots of arbitrariness. He has parts that are possibly separated, and so on. Not to mention that a bearded sky man would plausibly be contingent, whereas the non-classical theistic God is necessarily existent. I don't see why all these points and more don't count as having deep metaphysical significance. Indeed, a denial that they have such significance seems obviously wrong to me. So that's the first point. There are lots of relevant dissimilarities between the bearded sky man and the non-classical theistic God that render the former, absurd anthropomorphism, but the latter clearly not. Second, I have no clue what's anthropomorphic about an absolutely perfect, necessarily existent, radically independent, supreme, utterly unlimited, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, perfectly good, perfectly free, perfectly rational, immaterial, providentially governing creator and sustainer of literally everything else. Non-classical theistic views generally affirm all of that. And to affirm all of that is to cast anthropomorphism to the flames. No human is anything like any of that. Humans are uniformly radically imperfect, contingently existent, radically dependent, certainly not supreme, limited in countless ways, lacking in knowledge, lacking in power, certainly not omnipresent, very often evil, not perfectly free, but instead are often slaves to our passions and suffer from weakness of will, very often irrational, material, and don't create and sustain everything else. Just because God experiences succession, or just because God's properties are numerically distinct from one another, doesn't somehow mean that God is like Zeus, or like that he's somehow like a bearded man in the sky, or that he's somehow human-like, or that he's somehow less ultimate. Like this is the level of discourse that we've reached. And moreover, this is my third and final point in response to this mistake. And this is a big, I don't grant it, of course, for the first two reasons that I just mentioned, but if non-classical theistic views are guilty of anthropomorphism, well then so too is classical theism. Right? Like consider impersonalist conceptions of Brahman, which is just this universal consciousness. It's like pure consciousness at the foundation of reality. It's this pure, absolutely simple consciousness. Or the Neoplatonic one, which is this absolutely simple being in which there's like literally no differentiation whatsoever, no distinctions whatsoever, not even distinctions between like thinker and the object of thought, not distinctions among Trinitarian persons or anything like that. No, all of that is utterly foreign to the one. Consider impersonalist conceptions of these sorts of things as ultimate realities. A proponent of such views could berate classical theism as anthropomorphic with far more legitimacy than the internet classical theists charge toward non-classical theistic views. For classical theists, ultimate reality is personal. He literally has pronouns that he prefers we call him by, at least if you follow the Christian tradition. He's an intentional agent with free will and acts for reasons, if only analogously so. He desires relationships with creatures. He loves creatures. He even has emotions, though not passions. And as I say here, divine impassibility actually does not deny that God has emotions in the broad sense of valenced, affective conscious states. Impassibility simply denies that God can suffer, that God can experience passions, which would be happenings to God, and are distinct from emotions broadly construed, and denies that God can be causally influenced or moved by things. But that's distinct from emotions in this broad sense of valenced affective consciousness, okay? The classical theistic tradition is fraught with attributions of emotion in that broad sense to God, as when, for example, they describe his experiential life as one of undisturbable blessedness or bliss or happiness. So anyway, for most classical theists, ultimate reality is literally personal, has pronouns that he prefers that we call him by, is an intentional agent with free will, and he acts for reasons, desires relationships with creatures, loves creatures, has emotions. If that isn't anthropomorphism, what is? At the very least, all of these affirmations are clearly far more anthropomorphizing than saying, hey, maybe God's knowledge that 1 + 1 = 2 is not numerically identical to God's love of creatures, or to God's act of creating the universe. What a radical thesis. So yeah, the aforementioned affirmations by classical theists are clearly far more anthropomorphizing than merely attributing change and a non-simplicity to ultimate reality. And again, all of this is like assuming that non-classical theistic views are also guilty of this kind of anthropomorphism, which I wouldn't grant for the reasons mentioned above. And now we are on to mistake number 152, the label theistic personalism. I put this as a mistake because the label is pretty popular in some spheres, but it's pretty unhelpful, unclear, and generally to be avoided, at least in my view, for several reasons. First, it's not used very widely among scholars working in models of God and conceptions of ultimate reality. It's employed mostly by internet Thomists and a small handful of classical theist scholars who generally use the term disparagingly to cover basically any model of God they don't like. Second, it's also typically used pejoratively and disparagingly, and this is something that non-classical theists themselves have even pointed out in the literature. And the very fact that people being labeled in a particular way tend to resist that label and view it as disparaging is prima facie a reason not to label them that way. So that's a second reason not to use the label. Thirdly, the term is deeply confusing and misleading, since classical theists explicitly think that God is personal, and so seem to be legitimately deemed personalists as well. Indeed, many classical theists say that God is not only personal, but a person. To me, this is a distinction without a difference, but set that aside. Consider Bill Vallicella, a classical theist and author of the SEP entry on divine simplicity. That's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Vallicella says, classical theism is a personalism. God is a person, and we, as made in the image and likeness of God, are also persons. Or consider my old professor Jeffrey Brower, a staunch proponent of a truthmaker account of divine simplicity and a classical theist himself. He says God is a person, at least in the broad sense of an entity possessing the sorts of mental states generally regarded as constitutive of personhood. Or consider Alexander Proust, who says the exact same thing in these publications. Or Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann, who say the same thing here. Or countless other classical theists besides, who explicitly say that God is a person. Or consider Aquinas himself in De Potentia Dei. Aquinas says, "Yet that which the word signifies, namely that which subsists in an intellectual nature, is appropriate to God, and for this reason the term person is properly ascribed to God." Aquinas also says, "Then, since whatsoever is most excellent in creatures should be attributed to God, it is fitting that the word person should be attributed to God." In the same article, Aquinas explains that the mode of existence signified by the word person is most exalted, namely, that a thing exists by itself. Aquinas also considers and rejects an objection to the view that God is a person on the basis of God's not being within a genus. Aquinas replies that although God is not in the genus of substance as a species, he belongs to the genus of substance as the principle of the genus. In fact, several objections Aquinas considers in the article explicitly use a person as applied to God, and Aquinas not only doesn't object to such usage, but follows it. Objection 5 in the article is that since a person is an individual substance, and since individual substances must be individuated from other things, and since matter is the principle of individuation, God, if he were a person, would have to be material. And yet, of course, God is immaterial. In clear reference to God, the only immaterial thing at issue, Aquinas responds that there is no reason why there should not be an individual substance and a person in immaterial things. So in short, the moniker theistic personalism is monumentally confusing and misleading, since classical theism itself treats God as personal, and indeed, typically, a person. In fact, on this point about being confusing and misleading, I've received like dozens of messages and emails over the years from people who think that the classical theistic God isn't even personal as a result of this framing by Brian Davies and Ed Fazer and David Bentley Hart and so on, of the opposition between classical theism and theistic personalism. They think, oh, classical theism isn't theistic personalism, so God isn't personal? Like, wow, they view God as impersonal? Like, that's not good. But that's a demonstrable confusion, because all classical theists certainly want to say that God is at least minimally personal, at least in an analogous sense. And yet using the moniker of theistic personalism and contrasting it with classical theism has had tangible negative effects, and that it has led many people to think that classical theism construes God as impersonal, as opposed to the personalism. So this sort of framing, the framing that makes use of theistic personalism and contrasts it with classical theism, has tangible negative effects. It demonstrably leads to monumental confusion, and is profoundly misleading. Its confusion, as I say here, is palpable. So that's the third reason why I think this phrase probably shouldn't be used. It's deeply confusing and misleading, since classical theists explicitly think of God as personal, and so are legitimately deemed personalists. But anyway, back to the reasons for why the label theistic personalism should probably be avoided. We've covered 3 reasons already, and so here's a 4th. The scope of the term theistic personalism seems to cover a range of views so vastly divergent that the term seems to have little by way of meaningfully valuable content. Among those I've seen classed in the camp of theistic personalists are open theists, neoclassical theists, pantheists, panentheists, process theists, and even people who hold to divine timelessness, divine immutability, divine impassibility, and simply reject the traditional doctrine of divine simplicity, say because they think God isn't numerically identical to all of God's acts, or because they think God has distinct properties, or they think God can vary intrinsically across worlds, say vary in his intrinsic belief states or his intrinsic intention states across worlds, or vary in his intrinsic experiential states when he engages in different relationships with different creatures in different worlds. None of these groups share any overarching metaphysical or epistemological system. There is no unified methodological approach to questions of God, his nature, and his relation to the world. In fact, the methodological approaches often vastly contrast with one another. They don't understand parts in the same way. They don't understand the divine attributes in the same way. They don't all agree on whether language about God is primarily univocal or analogical, and so on. There seems then to be little by way of meaningful, evaluable content to quote-unquote theistic personalism, as there is in classical theism, open theism, and these other terms. I get the sense that what it is to be a theistic personalist, according to internet classical theists, is simply to be a theist who is not a classical theist. But then we should simply use the term non-classical theist, since it's far clearer, doesn't have disparaging connotations, far more helpful, doesn't lead to palpable confusion, and far less prone to misunderstanding. So anyway, those are 4 reasons why I avoid the term theistic personalism, and why I think you probably should too. Okay, on to mistake number 153, saying that God is not a being, but instead he is being itself. Even under Thomism, God is both being itself and a being. Okay, as Gavin Carr, perhaps the foremost Thomist scholar around today, writes on page 154 in his book Aquinas' Way to God, but if esse tantum, think of that as God, it's like existence itself, think of it like that. But if esse tantum subsists and is complete in itself, then it is a subsisting individual. Given that esse tantum is an individual that subsists, esse tantum is also an ens, that is, a being, a that which is. Esse tantum, then, while signified in the abstract terms of esse, or being, is indeed a concrete individual. Esse tantum is a single, immaterial, subsistent individual. Jeff Brouwer, again, prominent philosopher, specializing in medieval philosophy and himself a classical theist, says again that God is a person, at least in the broad sense of an entity, possessing the sorts of mental states, blah, blah, blah. Likewise, prominent Aquinas scholar Eleanor Stump points out that for Aquinas, God is both being itself and also a being. She says this in her 2016 book, The God of the Bible and the God of the Philosophers. So, in short, if you hear someone say that under classical theism or under Thomism, God is not a being, you can pretty safely conclude that they've only consumed the work of a select few popularizers and are unfamiliar with the scholarly literature itself, as well as Aquinas' own writings, as we saw up here with like De Potentia Dei. Alright, mistake number 154, conflating Thomism and classical theism. So, note that Thomism is not the same thing as classical theism. I see people on the internet sphere equate them a lot. Thomism is a particular version of classical theism, in that it affirms, in addition to all the things that kind of core theism affirms, God's omnipotence and omniscience and so on, it affirms that God is firstly timeless, secondly simple, thirdly impassible, and fourthly immutable. We're not going to go through what those are here. I've gone through them elsewhere on the channel. So Thomism affirms that kind of core of classical theism, but it goes on to add basically an overarching worldview based on Aquinas' metaphysics and epistemology and philosophy of nature. But not all classical theists go along with that metaphysics and epistemology and philosophy of nature, and not all classical theists agree that God is quote-unquote being itself, since not all classical theists agree with the background metaphysics that assumes. There are lots of other sorts of classical theists, some of which are people like Neoplatonists, Scotists, Palamites, and so on. So anyway, don't conflate Thomism and classical theism, they're not the same thing. Okay, mistake number 155, saying that analogical predication is non-literal. So like saying that analogical predication is like metaphorical. So when we say that God is powerful, and when we say that power here, or being powerful here, we're predicating that of God only analogically, God is still literally powerful. It's not that God is like only metaphorically powerful, but he's not literally powerful. No, he is literally powerful. Analogical predication is a kind of literal predication wherein one term is used in a distinct but at least similar sense to another term. It's not metaphor or allegory or anything like that. On to mistake number 156. If classical theism is true, well then God is just an abstract causally impotent property. So this is a sort of, and then they go on to say, well, that's absurd, so classical theism must be false. This argument is not a good argument against classical theism. It originates in Plantinga, but as I say here again, it's not a good argument since it simply foists upon classical theists an account of properties that they would simply reject. In particular, they reject the version of Platonism underwriting this objection on which properties are just causally effete or acausal abstract objects. Note though, as I say here, that classical theists are also prone to foisting upon non-classical theists accounts of properties and parts and dependence that non-classical theists would simply reject. Like, we literally saw that in an earlier mistake. Alright, mistake number 157. The Euthyphro dilemma proves divine simplicity. This is so painful. I address this in this video here. You can find it in the timestamp. I talk about Euthyphro in there. Just check out my responses in there. I'm too lazy and too tired to play this right now, but if you're curious, you can check it out. Again, you can find this video in the resource document linked in the description, or you could just go to my classical theism playlist and it'll be one of the earliest videos in that playlist. Alright, mistake number 158. The god of non-classical theism is different from Zeus, only in degree. This is similar to an earlier mistake, but it's slightly different. And we are really at the bottom of the barrel here, I know, but somehow these sorts of sentiments are rampant among internet classical theists and internet Thomists. So, in short, this claim is obviously false. Zeus is contingent, whereas the god of non-classical theism is uniquely metaphysically necessary. This is not a mere difference in degree. The god of non-classical theism is not only independent, but also everything apart from God depends on God for its existence. This is totally different from Zeus, who is situated alongside a pantheon and requires a whole host of external factors to be in place for him to exist. The god of non-classical theism is utterly unlimited, which is categorically different from the limited nature of Zeus, and so on down the list. I mean, I think Zeus is supposed to be physical, like supposed to be material, but like that's obviously categorically different from being immaterial and non-physical. So it's like, it takes like milliseconds of thought to see that these things are mistaken. Alright, mistake number 159. Only divine simplicity secures monotheism, or denying divine simplicity entails the possibility of polytheism. Oh boy, so I addressed this argument in this video here, the arguments for classical theism. I also addressed it in this blog post here, and this blog post here. There are so many mistakes about this. In fact, the arguments for thinking that divine simplicity itself does indeed secure monotheism are themselves subject to incredibly powerful objections. And moreover, it's quite easy to see how non-classical theistic views, which deny divine simplicity, can easily secure monotheism. It's relatively easy to argue that there can only be one perfect being, for instance. You don't need divine simplicity. All you need is perfection to secure that kind of thing, together with certain intuitively plausible claims about which properties are perfections. Brian Lefthal points out in various published works of his that uniqueness itself is plausibly a perfection, and he gives various reasons for thinking that's the case, but there are also other plausible perfections, like being the source of everything apart from oneself. If that's a perfection, well, then there couldn't be two perfect beings, because each of them would have to have the perfection, and so each of them would have to be like the source of the other one, which doesn't make any sense. It's a kind of vicious circle of dependence and so on. So anyway, I'm being intentionally brief on this mistake because it's painful, and I don't want to talk about things that cause me pain. But what I just said there gives you a glimpse into the kinds of responses developed in these sorts of pieces. Firstly, that the arguments for thinking that divine simplicity does indeed secure monotheism are quite sorely lacking. And moreover, there are lots of ways to secure monotheism apart from a commitment to divine simplicity. So, on to mistake number 160, 7 common misunderstandings of existential inertia. And here we are going to go to a blog post of mine, So You Think You Understand Existential Inertia. So anyway, this is a long post, and most of it is expanded upon in my book, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. But anyway, here are some of these common mistakes. Firstly, I see so much ambiguity when people are talking about existential inertia. So a common mistake is to entirely overlook that, quote-unquote, existential inertia is ambiguous. In particular, it's ambiguous between, 1, the thesis of existential inertia, which is a proposition that purports to describe the way that reality is, and 2, the phenomenon of existential inertia, which is like the manner in which things persist according to the existential inertia thesis, or EIT. The thesis is just the claim that some temporal concrete objects persist in the absence of both external sustenance, or conservation, and sufficiently destructive factors. The phenomenon is the actual persistence of one or more temporal concrete objects without external sustenance and destruction. To refer to the thesis, we can use EIT, and to refer to the phenomenon, we can use something like inertial persistence. But anyway, that's an ambiguity that crops up so much, and it infects people's reasoning about existential inertia. Another common mistake is thinking that EIT provides or purports to provide an explanation of persistence. No, that's not true. EIT merely purports to describe the manner in which some temporal concrete objects persist. It leaves open, 1, whether there is an explanation for persistence, and 2, what that explanation is, if there is one. EIT is a descriptive thesis, not an explanatory thesis. It's compatible with there being an explanation, but by itself it's not attempting to provide an explanation. Here's a descriptive thesis. There's a little bit of mud on my carpet right now. Okay, I'm not trying to explain why there's mud on the carpet or anything like that. I'm just describing that there's mud on the carpet. That's compatible with there being an explanation for the mud on the carpet, and indeed I can go on to provide that. But that descriptive thesis, that there's mud on the carpet, does not imply that, it's just a brute fact that there's mud on the carpet. No! Because you can supplement that with some kind of explanation for why there's mud on the carpet. Similarly, EIT, which is a description, a purported description at least, of the manner in which things persist, it can be and should be supplemented with one or more metaphysical accounts of EIT. These accounts just basically aim to provide an explanation of why things persist in existence in the way that EIT describes. So don't think that EIT provides or is intended to provide an explanation of persistence. That's the job of metaphysical accounts of EIT, and we take up a ton of such accounts in our book. So check it out if you're interested. A third mistake is thinking that EIT renders persistence brute or unexplained or perhaps even inexplicable. That's just false. No, EIT purports merely to describe the way in which temporal concrete objects, or some subset thereof, persist. It entails nothing about whether there's an explanation of persistence, and if there is, what that explanation would be. And again, we talk about lots of different such explanations in our book. A fourth mistake is thinking that existential inertia is a property. I mean, the first mistake in thinking this is its failure to disambiguate existential inertia. I mean, it could refer either to the thesis or the phenomenon. The former obviously isn't a property, it's just like a thesis. But the phenomenon of inertial persistence by itself doesn't entail that there's some property exemplified by concrete objects corresponding to inertial persistence. It's not even clear what such a property would amount to, and we can consistently deny that things would have some property corresponding to it, while nevertheless saying that things do indeed still persist in accordance with how the existential inertia thesis says that they do. A fifth mistake is thinking that EIT, if true, would have to apply to literally everything, like every event, every state of affairs, every property, every object, and so on, but that's not true. It only applies, at least as we articulate EIT, to, firstly, temporal things, secondly, concrete things, thirdly, concrete things which are objects in particular. So objects, things like particles and planets and trees and humans and phones and photons, as opposed to properties like redness or events like a soccer match. And moreover, as we articulate EIT, it only says that temporal concrete objects, or some subset of temporal concrete objects, persist in the relevant way. Okay. A sixth mistake is thinking that EIT is inherently atheistic. That's false. So long as you think God is temporal, God is then going to be a concrete object which persists in existence in the absence of something else that sustains him, and of course in the absence of anything that destroys him. So EIT is actually perfectly compatible with God existing. I mean, and it could also be the case, I mean, if God's timeless, it could still be the case that, there's just some temporal concrete object which persists in existence in the way that EIT describes. God just doesn't have to sustain it. So that's another way that theism could be true and EIT is true. So no, EIT is not inherently atheistic. If you say that, you are hopelessly confused. And the seventh mistake is thinking that defenders of EIT always have a burden to positively justify the truth of existential inertia thesis. That's just false. Whether the defender of EIT has a burden to positively justify its truth depends on the dialectical context at hand, right? If the context is one wherein someone is offering a positive argument for classical theism, one of whose premises requires the falsity of EIT, well then all the defender of EIT needs to do is argue that nothing in the argument, that is, nothing in the relevant premise or what is said on its behalf, gives those who accept or are neutral on EIT sufficient reason to abandon their position. Right? The onus in this context is not on the defender of EIT to positively justify EIT and prove that the premise in question is false by proving EIT true. No, they need only show that the argument and what's said on its behalf fails to prove that EIT is false. This all goes back to the distinction between undercutting and rebutting defeaters. Covering that was one of the most important mistakes, and it reverberates throughout the entire series, and mistaking those two, rebutting and undercutting defeaters, is responsible for untold confusions on the internet sphere. Mistake number 161 is mounting the simple modal collapse argument. There are more complex modal collapse arguments that may very well have teeth, but the simple modal collapse argument, which basically just says, hey, God is going to have to be, under divine simplicity, identical to all his acts, but then he's going to have to be identical to his creative act. And so since God is necessary, his creative act's going to have to be necessary, and so it seems like creation's then going to have to be necessary. Actually, although that reasoning is deceptively simple and seemingly convincing, as I just articulated it, that kind of argument does not actually succeed, as I and others explain. You can check out my article, The Fruitful Death of Modal Collapse Arguments. I explain why that particular kind of simple modal collapse argument doesn't work. But alas, responses to the argument and explanations of why it doesn't work may very well lead the classical theist into accepting some pretty implausible consequences, at least by some people's lights. I explore some of those consequences in this article later on, and in separate articles that I've published on those particular problems that I developed later on in this article. Okay, anyway, I'm actually not going to belabor this point. I just wanted to note this as a mistake because it's particularly common, and it's deceptively simple, and as I said, kind of deceptively convincing as well. But when you actually try to kind of rigorously and clearly state the argument, there are subtle but crucial problems that arise. Okay, and then the final mistake for today is mistake 162, claiming that open theists deny divine omniscience. No, they don't. And also, the mistake here is kind of just failing to distinguish between different kinds of open theism, like open future open theism versus limited foreknowledge open theism. So here we are going to play 1159 to 1818 of this video here, my interview with Dr. Patrick Todd.
Two versions of open theism. So right, I mean, historically, a big driver of interest in this whole problem has been the connection between this issue and issues regarding divine omniscience and divine foreknowledge. If you combine an open future view with theism, you get basically what I call, and what others have called, open future, open theism. I mean, it's not very complicated. It's just sort of the conjunction of the open future view together with the idea that there's some omniscient being. And so on this kind of account, no future contingents are true, and so God doesn't know future contingents, right? So if we ask God, is there going to be a sea battle tomorrow? It's a little bit delicate about what to say at this point, but God would have to say, look, it's not true that there's going to be, it's not true that there's going to fail to be. I mean, it's open. Because God is omniscient, that would have to be the point of view even of God. There is a different version of what's sometimes called open theism, and that's the limited foreknowledge view. So on this type of view, which is defended by Swinburne, Hasker, Van den Wagen, future contingents are either true or false. Some future contingents are true, but just not even God knows exhaustively which are true and which are false. So the basic idea is just that there are some truths about what's going to happen that not even an ideal knower can know. So both views agree on this much, that there are some events such that God knows neither that they will occur nor that they won't. Um, for the limited foreknowledge person, that's a matter of God not knowing some truth, right? There's some truth here that God doesn't know. But for the open future person like myself, this will amount to God not knowing what's not there to be known.
Yeah, definitely. So, just a summary for the audience. There are two versions of open theism here that we're covering. One of them is open future open theism, and the other one is limited foreknowledge open theism. Open future open theism says that there are no true future contingents, and as a result of that, God doesn't know any true future contingents, anything like that. So that's open future open theism. And then limited foreknowledge open theism says, hey, there are true future contingents, but for whatever reason, God cannot know them. Okay. Now there is this other view. I guess it's a kind of limited foreknowledge open theism, but it says that future contingent truths are there, but God can know them, but God like chooses not to know them. So that's another, I guess, option in logical space, although it's nowhere near as popular as the view that God cannot know them. I just wanted to mention that for the audience. That's there in logical space, just to give people a sense of what options there are. Okay, so I do want to pause briefly to explain, or to have you explain, why open future open theism doesn't deny divine omniscience and also doesn't like seem to problematically like limit God. So yeah, I'll just turn that over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's kind of clear that open future open theism won't give you any kind of denial of omniscience just because, um, look, I mean, for any true claim, God is going to know that claim. I mean, just because, you and I disagree about what's true. I mean, maybe you think there are more truths than I do. That alone isn't going to amount to a difference in omniscience, right? So that's the kind of basic view. I mean, um, it seems pretty clear that the open future view is not going to amount in itself anyway to a denial of omniscience. But yeah, I mean, in terms of why, God being limited, yeah, I wouldn't think that this view would in itself imply something like that. I mean, maybe other things that like historical open theists have wanted to say might imply something like that, but this view in itself, I wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. And as I think about it, I mean, like some people argue, so here's an analogy. I mean, some people argue that um, at least some counterfactuals don't have like are gappy or they're indeterminate in truth value or whatever. So like consider the claim that if there were unicorns, then the average number of hairs on those unicorns would be even. Some people think that there's just no fact of the matter there.
Right.
um, and it'd be really weird to say to God, like, oh, since you're saying that there's no fact of the matter about that question, like, oh, I guess you're limiting God in somewhere, like God's no longer omniscient. It's like, what? I mean,
Right.
there's no fact of the there's no fact there for God to know, for him to fail to know. I mean, like, it's just the
Yeah.
nature of the counterfactual question. So it's like you're not limiting God. You're not certainly not denying his omniscience. You're saying that for every true, determinately true claim, God knows that claim and knows it infallibly. It's just here we have a claim which is just not determinately true at all, just by the nature of the claim or by the nature of the claim's relation to reality or whatever. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a good example here is fiction, I think. So, suppose as it were, I get to heaven and I'm like, God, tell me, what was Harry Potter wearing the day he first met, Hermione? I mean, or did he put on his left shoe first or his right shoe the day he first met Hermione? I mean, and God's like, there's nothing to say here. I'm like, I thought you were supposed to be omniscient. That's a weird thing to say. It's like, well, look, I mean, there's no fact of the matter about things like that. I mean, that's what we're saying about the future. Of course, that might be wrong. That might be a wrong view about the future. But the place to disagree here is about the view about the future, not the view about omniscience.
all right, and with that, we finish mistake number 162, and we finish part 6 of the Common Mistakes series. As always, if you enjoyed the video and if you enjoyed my content more generally, please smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications so you know when my videos actually come out. Unfortunately, YouTube doesn't give you the videos that you actually want to see, so if you want to actually know when my videos come out and you don't want to miss one, you can put on that little bell for notifications. And finally, if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon or making a one-time donation. Any amount helps me through grad school and helps me pay off my student debt from undergrad, and it just helps keep Majesty of Reason afloat. Much love, as always, to my existing patrons, and of course, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid, this is the Majesty of Reason, and peace out.